Empty room, her empty bed, a stack of poetry books she would no longer read, wind whistling through hollow places. But she got up and crawled to the side of the pavement. She sat down with her hands covering her ears. My own hands shook as I sat next to her. Riding in the front of the ambulance, I felt a quiet numbness that I later understood was fear. We sat in the emergency department for the next 3 hours, watching friends play silently on TV, guessing at what Monica and Chandler were fighting about. No concussion, no nothing, but somehow I could not get the fact that everything was okay to sink into my own head. Where is the chaplain? I kept wondering. I was calm that night, but in my sleep, I bit my lip until it bled. In the morning, it looked like a bee had stung me. Weeks later, that same friend and I constructed a cucumber trellis out of bamboo poles for a garden I had planted by chance. I had scattered seeds to the wind without reading the backs of packages, and the cucumbers and squash and kale came up healthy and green and shouting into the void. I could not make sense of all the dichotomies. It was not just that my patients were dying, but that they were dying alone, or that they were the ones dying and leaving other people alone, or that they were dying in pain, or that they wanted to die, or that they would have given anything not to die, but did not have the right things to give, or God wasn't really in the business of bargaining anyways. Or their deaths were beautiful and painless. Their spirits left their bodies peacefully, and everyone sighed over the prayers I offered in commendation. So rarely. Some days I felt happy. I took in the slight chlorine smell of the atrium fountain and the trees growing up towards the glass ceiling, the sun that came through in small parcels of light, resting on tables and chairs and happy and sad and utterly distraught faces. A pudding and Oreo parfait from the cafeteria, and how quickly the North Pavilion elevators came, rising story after story, in a large gold box whose doors opened onto a view of the Long Island Sound. The patient who was ecstatic to be going home after 3 weeks, now happily engaged in conversation about whether the pain or boredom had been worse. Another who described the turtle-shaped urn she had picked out for her ashes before regaling me with comical stories of her dating life. Chaplaincy was magnificent, and then suddenly it wasn't. Fog smeared the city. A name was erased from my patient list, an unexpected death. A patient who had waited for hours in the emergency room described the feeling of bugs crawling all over her, big and small ones with furry feet scuttling across her corneas, dissolving to dust on her tongue. Suddenly, I would have the urge to stick my fingers in my ears and plead with them, with the patients and God and myself. I can't help you anymore. I'm so sorry. I just can't help you. The way the smell of blood bloomed in a room like some noxious flower, and I felt something inside me screaming along with the patient's son or partner or mother, no, this can't be happening. Put the blood back. Make it stop. After my first 24-hour on-call, I fled the hospital on shaky legs, carrying a paper towel bundle of cuttings from a supervisor's plants. The sky was pale blue, clouded with cream clouds. A line had already formed inside Dunkin' Donuts. People were ordering lattes and egg and cheese croissants. Everything and nothing had changed. People are dying in there, I wanted to point out to people walking by in the street. I don't know if you realized, but in the hospital right there in the corner, people are dying. At home, I cried on my roommate's shoulder. She made me toast with marmalade and sent me to bed. After napping, I planted my cuttings. I walked around the house listlessly. I watched too many episodes of Jane the Virgin. The night before, I had stood silently next to a woman as the medical team tried for half an hour to bring her husband's heart back to life. She urged them over and over not to stop. And finally, they gently explained that if the heart stops beating for too long, the brain is irreparably damaged. They were sorry. She touched her hand to her heart. She fell to her knees. The medical team shuffled out as she began to sob. She clung to my arm as she apologized to her husband's body over and over, to his CPR bruised chest and cracked ribs, to his tube-scraped throat. That night, she went home to an empty house. She turned on the lights as usual, put her keys in the blue ceramic bowl on the entryway table. Blue ceramic bowl. The words had a new opacity. There was also the man who shot himself in the chest. I know I stood there for too long after his death had been called. His chin was tilted back, his long hair falling from the table. There was blood everywhere, pooling on the table and the floor, smeared across the team's blue gowns. But all I could think was that he was very young and good looking, and he didn't really look dead. He had a story, but I did not know it. The fluorescent lights took on a shocking blaze, illuminating a stained gray t-shirt cut in half, a nurse tracking bloody footprints down the hall. When I was younger, I thought that even if something terrible happened, we would have some supernatural sense of peace, where angels would come to us in our dreams and tell us that so-and-so is okay. Or if that did not happen, we would look up and see a small white bird perched on a tree branch, or we would look down and see a flower. I did not consider that there might come a moment when life was not redeemed, not in the small picture, not in the big picture. Maybe the problem is that my garden is not doing well. It has been a hot, dry summer, and the garden has not had enough water. I left for a few weeks, and when I returned, I found my beans crawling with fuzzy yellow bugs. I got a pair of clippers out of the shed. I tore the bean plants down and threw them into a black bucket, along with a dozen rotting tomatoes and a squash plant that had died just as it began to flower. I could not understand that it was I who had not watered it, why this small thing, which I'd loved so much, had been taken from me. When I came back a week later, 2 flowers had come up alongside my withered tomato plants, a single sunflower and a single stem of pink blooms that looked something like a hollyhock. The sunflower had pink and yellow petals, a hybrid I had never seen before. I could not understand them, where they had come from or why. I considered the sky. I shrugged and walked away. I came back and took a picture to send to my mother. One recent morning, in that small enigma of a moment that lies directly between waking and sleeping, I saw an image of an apple. I felt the heart-drenched way one feels when weeping, though I wasn't. Couldn't you have had more grace for us? I found myself saying. Couldn't you have loved us more? Even if none of those things in Genesis ever happened, why did we have to tell ourselves a story in which God turns us away over a piece of fruit? A patient with schizophrenia once told me that he had terrifying dreams, that the devil spoke to him and told him to do terrible things, and that demons lingered in his apartment. Perhaps he was just out of high school. There was an unparalleled earnestness with which he sorted through the tangles in his brain to ask me how I thought he could go about distinguishing the voice of God. The room we were sitting in was small, the stiff pleather chairs almost knocking knees. The door was ajar so that the security guard at the front door could see what was happening. The patient leaned slightly forward. Do you think God is here with us now?
Thank you so much, Heather. That was incredible and so insightful. Wow. Oh my goodness. This is gonna be good. This is gonna be a good reading. All right. So I think it's now time to introduce our guest of honor here. So I'm gonna bring up Megan McDermott herself. And I'm gonna give a quick reading of the bio for our introduction, and then I'll let Megan take it away. Megan McDermott is a poet and Episcopal priest living in Western Massachusetts. She discovered passions for both poetry and preaching while in college at Susquehanna University in her home state of Pennsylvania. Press led her to the Yale Institute for Sacred Music, an interdisciplinary program dedicated to religion and the arts, which she graduated from in 2018. She is also the author of the chapbook Prayer Book for Contemporary Dating, Ethelzine and Micropress 2021, and the full-length collection Jesus Merch, a catalog and poems, Fernwood Press forthcoming. When she's not writing or ministering, you might find Megan enjoying tea, hula hooping, live tweeting reality TV, or taking many selfies. Connect with Megan more at meganmcdermottpoet.com or on Twitter at megmcdermott92. Now, please give the biggest welcome to Megan McDermott.
Hello, all. Hi, friends. Thank you for being here. The poems you're going to hear go back all the way to Susquehanna times, up through 2020. So all of you who are here, who have accompanied me through the writing of these poems in different ways. So I just am honored that I get to share them with you tonight. Before I really dive into the reading, I wanted to acknowledge there's a lot of terrible things happening in the world, as MJ referenced. I'm not going to try to speak to all of them, but one thing I've really thought about with this book, what I'm trying to do in so much of my writing is to honor agency and complexity in the context of a faith that is often not honored that, which to me speaks directly to the attacks on reproductive justice that are happening right now, and to the abortion conversation. So in celebration and honor of the release, I'm making a donation tonight to the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, which organizes people of faith to advocate for reproductive rights, to advocate for reproductive justice, and to spiritually accompany people through abortion. So I am just going to drop this in the chat if anyone feels so moved to also donate. To me, it feels connected to what this work is trying to accomplish. But with that said, let's move on to some actual poems. So I'm going to start with Woman as Communion #1, which is where the collection's title comes from. As we go, I'm going to try to provide a little bit of Bible context, though I know some of you have a lot of Bible context. But the only thing for this poem is that I use the phrase imago Dei, which is Latin for image of God. And basically, that comes from Genesis, where it says all of humanity is created in the image of God. So this is Woman as Communion #1. You might appear unthreatening, consumable, innocuous as bread, as wafer, but they were never innocuous either. It is not wrong to want to offer yourself. The wrongness comes through those who misinterpret offering, who do not know that their stomachs will be struck with full body and gushing blood, that imago Dei runs underneath and even in those curves. You will leave them kneeling, men in pews with begging prayers, realizing they could not contain you or tame you with their mouths. So the poems in this book come in 3 sections. So first I'm going to do some poems from the section Communing with Women in Scripture. And this is the first poem in that section called Visions Concerning Her Killing of Sisera, which is about the story of a woman, Jael, who in the midst of kind of the warfare in the Hebrew Bible, welcomes a man into her tent under the guise of hospitality, and then murders him with a tent peg. So a great example of biblical womanhood. So this is Visions Concerning Her Killing of Sisera. But Jael, wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand. Judges chapter 4, verse 21. Crescendo of chirping. Birds descend on a discarded wheel. A spider bite on her upper thigh. She presses into red bump with nail, laughs as it breaks open. Kneeling woman with a spoon scoops up cracked ground, grunting and quaking like a mother during birth. 2 children bathe in the river. Younger scrambles towards older, grabs onto his head, bears down, marvels at the loss of breath. The man and wife are naked when she bites his neck so hard his head detaches from his body. He blinks while she toys with the strings that had held him together, twines veins around her wrists like bracelets. 2 hungry oxen live together in the last days and coax each other to sleep with stomach rumble lullabies. One day, the smaller ox notices its growl is louder, so it gores its other, the only breathing being in miles or maybe all of Earth. Horns catch on organs. There is feasting. I flinch no more than a man. This next poem is probably about the most widely known Bible story in the world about Adam and Eve. So I think the only context, in case people don't remember, is that God confronts Adam and Eve over eating the fruit, and Adam just totally throws Eve under the bus. So that is important for this poem. This is called To Adam. Adam, I now always tack a sigh to your name, a stand-in for more precise feelings. I know I shouldn't be mad still, but I am. It's personal, not principle, that you were the one to betray me, the same one who shared conversations unlike any I'd known my whole life. Forget that my life was only a day old. Forget that you were my only option. It was still extraordinary. The opening in me meeting the opening in you. To be fair, we didn't know how to be closed yet. Now we have learned to hold words under our tongues, vary the angles of shoulders, narrow and soften eyes. Adam, remember the way you kissed my tears, though we didn't know what they were yet, that my body had guessed at truth no apple needed to intuit, that perfection was temporary. You pressed your lips to each drop, telling me God had said you could drink of any water. All was yours for the tasting. That was the start. You tasted me in the dark, and I tasted you back. And we didn't know shame yet, but it still seemed special. Adam, you didn't even call me by name, the woman that you gave me. During those talks we had, the ones we'll never have again, you said it over and over, Eve, Eve, Eve. Each time like a key finding its proper slot. But now all words are different. And when I hear you repeat my name, it's ownership, irritation, lust if we're lucky. Recognition of us as separate, two, bound together by guilt and circumstance, unable to repeat the miracle of that first day. Staying up all night talking, bright with the hope exclusive to those who don't yet know the need for it. So this next poem is also about Eve, and it is about a painting by Hieronymus Bosch that if you want to look at, I'll drop that link in the chat also. But basically all you need to know is that if you look at the painting, the serpent kind of looks a little bit like Eve. So this is called Eve Addressing the Serpent That Mirrors Her, as painted by Hieronymus Bosch. You looked more like me than anything else I'd met yet, except for him. That chest like mine, cascade of blonde hair, fingers my size wrapped around fruit, someone unlike any of us forbade. Is familiarity why I said yes? Did I trust you like I trusted myself? And did I trust myself because nobody had told me not to yet? That's what they call sin, isn't it? A woman elevating her own voice. That is how we configure temptation. And by we, I mean Bosch, I mean focus on the family, I mean my own faulty memory filtered through the retellings of others. Only in flashes do I see the story I sometimes think is truth. A serpent more like Adam, sizing me up and saying, please add something. There must be more than what you already are. So this next poem is about a story from the first book of Samuel. And it's a story where two women are presented as rivals So of course, I am interested in the one who seems to be the bad one. So that's what this is about. Double portion. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to his wife, Peninnah, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah, he gave double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival used to provoke her severely. And that's from 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 4 through 6. Once you start getting into quantities of love, you're fucked. Couldn't it have all been done in similes instead? Hannah, I love you like when the moon is at its fullest, and gazing at it buoys belief. And Peninnah, I love you like an inside joke precisely landed, making one feel both seen and lighter. Distinct love, but equal meat. Instead, he scaled affection. So yes, my biting tongue bit. Sometimes people bite when the scales live beyond their grip. So this next poem is about Mary, and some of you probably know about Gnostic Gospels, which are basically early Christian texts that didn't make the cut into the official Bible. And so there's one Gnostic Gospel that describes how Mary gives birth, and that it is not a normal birth at all. And her midwife then does a physical test with her hands to see if it was a normal birth or not. And the woman's hand, as punishment from God, gets all burned up. So that's kind of the not biblical context of this story. So this is divine C-section. Details blessedly left out of the Bible and Christmas pageants. Mary and her manner of birthing. A Gnostic gospel declares cloud in cave followed by light. Baby appearing without gore. Skeptical midwife testing claims with fingers and leaving satisfied. Meaning divine C-section? No, something still less bloody. Christ osmosising out through immaculate skin? Thank God this Marian test did not become canon, further justifying men who never needed precedent anyway, but would love another reason to call their concerns holy, ignoring Salome's burned hand. Let Mary's virginity be flashy autonomy, sign, like Sojourner Truth said, of God not needing a man. Instead of another declaration that sainthood is being smooth and shut in the places where another woman might tear. So this is the last poem I'm going to share from the Bible Women section, and it's another Mary poem. And the context here is that Joseph is basically going to leave Mary and not marry her when she, shows up suddenly pregnant, until he has a dream and a vision from God telling him otherwise. So this is called Mary and Joseph Were Broken. Mary and Joseph were broken until they weren't. Didn't understand each other until they did. All it took was sleep, a dream, an angel. I want the kind of clarity that swoops down on someone in the course of a night. I want to know how to dream dreams that fuse together disparate hearts. So the next section of the book is called Communing with Jesus. And it's all poems that address Jesus more specifically. And there are two poems in here about envisioning Jesus as a woman. So I'm just going to read one of those, and this is called Christ's Dreams, Good Friday. And the only thing to know about this one is it mentions Mary a few times. That would be Mary Magdalene, one of Jesus's most prominent followers, not Mary, Jesus's mom. There are lots of Marys, as some of you know. So this is Christ's Dreams, Good Friday. Before they went to Gethsemane, she'd had Mary braid her hair tight, thinking she would need clear vision for what was to come. And yet, at every stage, she ends up longing for hair to fall, block the pressing gaze of Pilate, for whom she has no answers, hide tears from mocking soldiers as her brow tears to blood. It's halfway to Golgotha when she realizes what she needed was the moment the braid recalls. A follower more friend than anything else, touching her rhythmic and slow, without violence or demands that she save herself or any demands at all. What she needed, the fastening, heart and hair still somehow held together in Mary's fingers. As the braid flops heavy against her back, she turns the thwack of it into reminders. You are loved, really. Thwack. Really loved. Even if others take love's gift tight in their hands and yank. This next poem is called Jesus, Did You Grieve the Ascension? Jesus, did you grieve the ascension? Because it kind of reads like a curfew, as if the Father said, yes, you can go out one last time with your friends, but you have to be home by a certain hour back in bed, or more accurately, back at his right hand. If it wasn't for him, would you have stayed longer? Until your disciples' hair got gray and everyone saw your resurrection. Until it just became boring fact. Oh yeah, Jesus, we all know he's back. Did you stretch out your last visit longer than he would have liked? Allowing your new body to suffer for a few days from a heavenward pull, until finally you had to admit your new skin called for a different kind of air. In a way, you've been grounded, but also its opposite. Not contained, but transcendent, fluid, emanating spirit. And yet, does this nuance make any difference to a friend who wants to call upon you, not by settling down onto knees, clasping hands, bowing head, but by shouting your name and watching you turn the corner? This next poem is called Questions on a Good Friday When I Hate Someone. Crying in Gethsemane, did you think, Judas, I really fucking hate you? Or did you keep it at bay until the cross or Pilate's waiting room? At either point, a relatable thought. If it helps, love could even coexist with it. We'd allow that, your judging audience, since our most intense hates are often the ones most mixed with care. Curse him out, Jesus, just once before you let him rise again, forgiven. We are out here looking for it, even though you refuse. A model of how to hate and love and not be destroyed by either. And so this next poem, you will see that it's, the green screen is making it disappear. But you will see that this next poem is where the cover came from. And this is called Some Obscure Fact. At some medieval point, unicorns signaled incarnation, making whatever virgin lured one to her lap some sort of Mary. I had never heard of that, not through all of undergrad or 3 years of divinity school. I had never witnessed a preacher employ unicorns as sermon metaphor, or heard such a simile in prayer embedded in some liturgy striving towards freshness. Instead, I learned it in a cafe from a book bought on vacation, Hieronymus Bosch, Between Heaven and Hell. Art reminds me we lose symbols all the time. At a museum in Madrid, I stared at an infant Jesus squeezing Mary's breast, her milk sprinkling onto purgatory's sinners. Faith, same in name, encoded in images strange and unrelated to any belief I've ever had. Which of my meanings will expire without some obscure fact of history as frame? Is it only the name that lasts, pushing beyond all paradigms, past and present? Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I think I just have 3 more poems for us. Fittingly, Heather shared an essay about chaplaincy, and I have also had the experience of doing a hospital chaplaincy summer, and this is inspired in part by that. And it's inspired by Simone Weil, who is a philosopher, theologian type from the 20th century, who many people I encountered in div school loved her, and everything she wrote really grated upon my soul. So this is me arguing with Simone Weil. Sorry if you are a Simone Weil lover, anyone here. So this is called I and Maybe God Wait with Bated Breath for Your Reaching. Simone Weil claimed she would not reach out a hand for all the world's salvation unless she heard God's order. Decades later, patients at a Connecticut hospital claim to me that they do not pray for themselves, but only for others' much bigger concerns. Both make me wonder, how many have learned to manifest faith primarily through performances of not wanting? I want to teach them, Simone, or that reluctant woman on the 6th floor East Wing, about prayer, striving, and selfish faith that makes you look drunk. I want to proof text them, thrust forward Hannah's vigorous hankering for happiness. But maybe this is my lecture of choice solely because my own prayer can't stretch past this. Because I've not yet neared that void of union where one prays, thy will be done, without an asterisk noting preference of will. And there's a Bible reference in there I meant to note about the story of Hannah, which you can find in 1 Samuel, which is basically, she goes into a temple and prays to have a child, is very emotional, and the priest comes up and accuses her of being drunk, which she is not. She is just in the fields. So this next poem is called Resurrection Bruises. Then Jesus said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side." And that's from John chapter 20, verse 27. Pink wounds named for exes, ex-friends, and ex-fixations. The first woman I consciously liked, the man who couldn't be present. Manipulations, slashes, rejections, gashes, knees still skinned from girls who booed me in that 8th grade assembly. Marks of melancholy in permanent remission. Insecurities' imprints, though their contents have been shed. Sometimes they seem pointless, but they tether me to a shared story. We were human, and it was 50-75% bangs you up bullshit, and none of us technically survived, not without intervention. We were human, and we didn't imagine the pain of it, though it will seem far off there, except when an angel hand grazes a marred wrist and says, he has a scar there too. I think the last poem I'm going to share with y'all tonight is called Suggested Blessing for a New Prayer Book. And this I actually wrote for a project during my summer of hospital chaplaincy. That is just a fun fact. It's not very relevant to the poem. This is Suggested Blessing for a New Prayer Book. The blessing is that you're not who you thought you'd be. That year by year, God opens you to another self, hidden in some crevice of the spirit. The blessing is that God whispers over you declarations utterly unidentical to those spoken over your neighbor. The blessing is the thing you hear sometimes trickling underneath self-doubt. That it is rising like beer foam crawling up a bottle ready to crest. The blessing is a dream that didn't materialize, so you might meet the new one. The blessing is healing's call surpassing your propriety. The blessing is your failure to live up to a vision you crafted of yourself at 17. Now let me rest a hand on your forehead. We can pause and you can tell me something, anything. What you think about when trying to fall asleep, your first love, how often or seldom you cry. I'll wait. My words printed, maybe wrote, but blessing is never interchangeable. Know that I proclaim your worth while taking in the details, seeing the color of your eyes. And just a note on those last few poems, they transitioned into the third section of the book, which is called, oh gosh, what is it called? Communing with the Woman I Am. So those are some of the poems. There are more poems that I did not read that you can read in the book. So I'll pass it to MJ.
Well, don't go anywhere. Oh my God, that was so good. That was incredible. I hope y'all have ordered your copies of this lovely book already. I will drop a link in the chat in a minute for those that might not have. So with that being said, again, thank you so much for that beautiful reading, Megan. That was truly, truly wonderful. And it is always a pleasure to hear you read because these are some seriously powerful poems. And I want to throw out again to folks in the audience, please, if you have questions, drop them now. I'm going to start asking some Q&A questions. If there's anything that you're curious to ask, now is the time. But other than that, I'm just going to ask the questions that I've got prepped for now. So with that, I do want to start with a question because obviously a few of the poems reference and invoke the Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch. And thank you for putting that one link in the chat earlier. I thought that was super cool to just actually see it side by side while you were reading through. But can you explain the importance of this individual for those that might not be familiar? I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this work and why it was so important to bring the artist into the text.
Sure. Sorry. I'm gonna put in the chat kind of the most famous Bosch painting. But Bosch, basically a painter in the 1400s, early 1500s, who has very, I don't know, I would describe them as like vibrant and somewhat surreal paintings that are often religious and biblical in content. So what I put in the chat, The Garden of Earthly Delights, is one of his most famous works. It has this like very colorful depiction of a paradise, and everyone's like naked and has fruit on their heads, and interesting. And he has that next to this very like vivid hellscape, essentially. And so I just like love his paintings. I think they're so beautiful. But when I look at them, I'm also aware that it's a religious understanding that I like don't share at all. Like I feel like if Bosch and I sat down to talk biblical interpretation and theology, we would be on very, opposite ends of the spectrum. So thinking about this, I think in some ways that mirrors my relationship to scripture and to like Christianity as a whole, that like I personally find something so beautiful in my faith, and I find these beautiful things in the Bible. And also I find these like troubling things, and also the Bible is old, and we don't always think of things in the same way. So I think it provides a little bit of a parallel, like wrestling with Bosch and wrestling with scripture. And I think it's also just another way to enter into the stories of these women, because some of the poems that you heard are me directly taking on a character's voice. But I think there's also something important about dealing with the interpretations and representations of those women, because sometimes the representations of the women that have been passed down through the centuries are more troubling than what's actually there in the Bible.
No, absolutely. I think that's fascinating. Also, just because, and this actually will segue into the next question, but so much has been lost over time, so much knowledge about certain things, whether it is a faith, a religion, or now that we're seeing with general history, even though we have access to all of human knowledge and the internet. But there's so much people are just forgetting, or that's just, out of sight, out of mind, and that you wouldn't realize it. And so to segue, I would love if you could explain the symbolism of the cover, because in the poem, Some Obscure Fact, which you did read, you reference the unicorn as a lost symbol of incarnation for the Christian faith. But why was it so important for you to capture that obscurity and to bring that symbolism back on the cover?
Yeah, I put myself to my real background so I could actually hold the cover up. So it's interesting. This is not like the image that I had in mind when I was like writing the poems and thinking, oh, what could a cover be like if someone wants to publish these? And the illustrator, Mar Sprague, who is awesome, did like 3 very different mock-ups for the cover. And the other 2, I think, were much more aligned with what I thought I originally would want, which was playing on the like communion, Eucharist, sacramental side of things. But I loved the unicorn, and I started thinking about, why do I love the unicorn so much? And I think a part of it is the contrast between, I describe this book as like reckoning with the patriarchal legacy and present of Christianity. And I think if someone hears that, they could assume rightfully that it's all just like angry poems. And I think another poet could do a very valid book that's just angry poems about how messed up, Christianity is, but that's not who I am, right? Like I am actively
I see you, Megan. I think just angry all day.
Like, yeah, I'm like actively an Episcopal priest who preaches about the Bible like every other week and is like teaching it to young people. So for me, the book is much more about like, how do I come to a place of understanding of this tradition that is like whole and empowering for me. And so it spoke to me that it was like a calm cover, and it was like this beautiful cover, and that there's like a relationship happening, between, like, there's communion happening between this woman and the unicorn. And I think relationship is how I framed so much of what the book is doing, that like my processing of these patriarchal aspects of the tradition, I process that by leaning further into relationship with the scripture, into Jesus, further into relationship with myself, rather than distancing myself, if that makes sense.
No, that's beautiful. And to follow up on that, I am curious, since you have gone on this incredible exploration with this book, what do you hope that readers would take away from the chapbook in regards to maybe their own spirituality or defining their own faith?
Yeah, I think the big thing that I think I'm promoting in this book, that I try to promote in my life, is like imagination as an allowable part of our spirituality, like that imagination is a gift, and not something to be afraid of. So if you're engaging a particular tradition or a text, to not be afraid of using your imagination and saying, what would make this story or text or teaching mean more to me? Because I think that's what the poems try to do, is, imagine the stories in new ways, or like imagining Jesus as a woman. And that doesn't mean that, like, if I'm leading a Bible study, I'm like, well, actually my take on, King David is like actually what the Bible meant, but just acknowledging that there's like spiritual value in imagination, and honesty, I think, is the other part of it, of not being afraid to communicate to God, or however we each define that, or the God that you don't think exists, or the God that you're not sure exists, to be able to communicate to whatever that is for you, with honesty rather than performativity.
So when you were writing this, you talked about this a little bit during the reading, but you gave this 3-arc structure, and I am curious if you could talk a bit more why you chose these 3 specific kind of sort of communions as the 3 different arcs. So why, communing with women in scripture, why communing with Jesus, and then why communing with the woman that you are? Why the importance?
So I referenced this, and I don't think everyone was here when I first came in, that this chapbook was actually written over a lot of years, with the earliest poems being back when I was a junior in college. So if I'm doing math correctly, like 2012, 2013, and the latest poems in that batch being from 2020. So about like 7 years of my young adult, now not so young adult life. And over the years, I've tried like many different ways of trying to fit these poems together, because they weren't written with the thought they were all going to go together, but were some of my kind of favorite poems that I've written over the years. So I think it just took many attempts of like trying to think through what are the threads that are happening here. And I think it's interesting because the threads of, relationship with the women in scripture, relationship to Jesus, relationship to myself, like I saw that in the poems that meant a lot to me. And then I like see that in my life over those 7 years, as like those relationships for me are all intertwined, and all were things that I needed to pay attention to come to, I think, a healthier version of my faith than I had, when I first wrote these poems.
Right. That's perfect. Okay, so I have a few more questions. Again, if anyone in the chat wants to pop anything down, please do, or forever hold your peace. So we're getting down to the nitty gritty. With that, I do want to follow up and ask, we talked a bit about Borges. Obviously, work takes a lot of influence from scripture, but I would love to hear you talk more about some of your biggest influences during the writing of the chapbook.
Yeah. So this is another thing where it's interesting because I have to think back through a lot of years of writing. And so I don't know how transparent this influence is, but if anyone's familiar with the poet Denise Duhamel, I first came across her poem called Fornicating, which I quoted in a sermon once at Yale. I was like, to quote my favorite poem, Fornicating. But she has this ability to like just be really uncomfortably honest and like embarrassing about maybe it's not about her life, but it reads as like being that honest about her life. And I think I try to take that ethos into my writing of like just trying to go there. And I think that probably comes up more in the poems that are closer to my own voice rather than like a character. Mary Carr is a poet, has a collection called Sinner's Welcome that I read in college. And it was the first time I encountered a contemporary poet who was writing about Christianity in a way that like seemed interesting and seemed like valuable to people who didn't also share that religion. And since then, I feel like I found a ton of poets who live into that space of like engaging with the Bible or faith as conversation partners, but not in a didactic way. So like Mark Jarman and Padre Rotuma, who I took a workshop with and wrote 2 of those poems, Lucille Clifton. I've been very pleasantly surprised because I think my younger creative writing major self thought that you can't be literary and religious, and I think that is just not true when you start kind of entering further into the contemporary poetry space, which I'm grateful for.
Oh, it's absolutely true. And so I'm really excited right now because we actually did get 2 questions from the audience. This is a first for me. I was actually a little shook. That questions came through because this never happens. So thank you folks for submitting some questions. So I want to ask this first one from Melanie in the audience. And they ask, as a member of the clergy, do you ever fear how your writing will be perceived by your parishioners or authoritative body?
Yes. I think that's the short answer. I'm figuring it out as I go. I've been asked this before by people in the ordination process. And I'm constantly kind of trying to figure it out. And, my strategy is not asking for permission for things, which we'll see if that ever doesn't work out very well. But I think I try to maintain like some boundaries around it. It's hard with social media because like I have parishioners who follow me on Twitter, and so they know, but like when I'm posting about poetry on Facebook, I usually don't have parishioners set on those posts.
Friends, you just gotta keep it in the loop.
I'm like, then I have a reading at a friend's Episcopal church in Boston, and I don't want to have a reading at my own church, just because, not that I think anyone where I am, thankfully, would be too upset about anything that I wrote, but just because it's a level of like personal vulnerability and sharing that I think is difficult in the professional role. But Melanie, I'll let you know if I ever get into trouble. I do think I've talked about this before with more experienced priests.
Yeah.
I do think there will be congregations when I'm job searching in the future that would not be a good fit, because they can Google me and they can find like that I swear in poems about the Bible. They can find that like I write poems about dating,
It's
dismantling.
unbelievable, Megan.
Yeah, so I think it's just a matter of discerning, a community that, if they do stumble upon the poems, I'm not worried for my livelihood, which I happen to have because I'm in very like progressive Amherst with, everyone in my congregation is like an English professor. So they're chill, thankfully.
Absolutely. And one more from the audience, from Alexis. What topic ended up in this what topic that ended up in this collection was the most challenging to write about?
Hi, Lex. So I think it's a poem I didn't read. And I think I wrote this one in college too. So Lex, you might have heard it. It's called When David Was Captain of the Football Team. And it's about, sexual assault and rape culture, and the parallels to the David and Bathsheba story. And I remember it was so long ago that I read it, but it was after this terrible case of a high school student's sexual assault in Steubenville, Ohio, I believe. And so I think that kind of thing is just difficult because you like think through the ethics of writing it, right? Where I did a fictionalized kind of parallel to the Bible account, but it's like not my story. And yeah, wanting to have done that in a sensitive way. I'm trying to think, is there anything else like that made its way in here? Yeah, I think that, and that's probably that's the only poem that really deals with some of the sexual violence in scripture, which there are many other instances of that I could have gotten into more, but like I don't feel qualified at this point in my life to like write those poems necessarily. I think there are other people who would do that project really well.
Yeah,
but
incredibly difficult. I don't blame you. That's not an easy topic to jump into.
I'm glad that there's at least one poem that nods to those kind of complexities in there.
Well, thank you both for those questions. That really made my day. To actually get some questions from the audience, so that was incredible. I have two more for you, Megan, and then we'll wrap up for tonight. But I would love to know for you, what were the most important poems in this particular chapbook?
Yeah, I think, on a creative level, this was one of the first poems I read, Visions Concerning Her Killing of Sisera, about JL who kills someone with a tent peg. I had thoughts at one point of like moving where that poem comes in the book, because I thought, I have all these poems about Eve and I have all these poems about Mary, and I could just present everything in like the chronological order of the Bible.
Yeah.
But it felt important to me to start the women in scripture section with her, because I think it's disruptive. And she disrupts, I think, where our mind goes when we think of women and the Bible. This woman who just like goes to town at a man's skull with a tent peg. Like, that's not where my mind goes first.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. All right, so for my final question, you put in the very end of your gratitudes that for God who I truly believe, delights in poetry. And so I'm curious, if God is such a lover of poetry, if delights in poetry, what do you think their favorite poem would be from the chapbook?
I love that question. So I think, I think, and this is just me projecting my thoughts onto God as one does sometimes. I think more than literary merit when it comes to poems, I think God probably cares more about like what the poem offered me in the writing of it, right? Like what did that poem offer to me and my spirit and my well-being? And I think also like what does that poem end up doing for other people and how it connects with them? And I can't really speak to the second part, that's up to everyone else. But I think for me, the poems, looking through them, that like meant a lot to me personally. Questions on a Good Friday when I hate someone. I don't always think of my poems as prayers, but I think that one felt more like a prayer to me. It was like really something that I was working through at a time in my life where I was like heartbroken and like probably dealing with undiagnosed depression and, just trying to communicate with God and with myself about that. So that one, and then the last poem that I read, which is Suggested Blessing for a New Prayer Book. I think for me, that poem just encapsulates a lot of the ways that like present day me feels different from, the me in college who was first wrestling with like what it means to be a woman of faith. Like to me, that poem represents me affirming myself and hopefully the reader in that like you are your own unique person. Sometimes it's a good thing that life doesn't play out in the way that you think it should, and like there are more important things than being proper, and that like it just, for me, that poem feels like to get kind of Jesus-y. There's a gospel passage where Jesus talks about coming to bring not just life but abundant life. And I think for me, that poem is a poem of like abundant life, of like, I feel like my faith is, enhancing who I am and enhancing my life rather than boxing me in or constricting me into something, which is how I used to feel. So I think those two, I hope God appreciates them. I like to think she does. So
That is a beautiful answer, Megan. Thank you so much. On that note, everyone, that is the launch reading for tonight. That is the show. I want to thank Megan McDermott so much for the time, for this beautiful book. I'd love to thank Heather Burtman for reading that incredible essay, a very timely essay still. It's been so lovely to chat tonight, and thank you, audience, for participating. Please show some love in the chat for the readers tonight. Before we go, I am going to drop a link to the book for folks that might want to order it. And then I will also drop the link again to the org that Megan is donating to if folks are curious to learn more about them. And Megan, do you want to remind folks really quick what this group is for folks that might have come in late?
Oh yeah. In the beginning, I was talking about lots of terrible things going on in the world, but in honor of the book release, I am donating to Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, which does basically interfaith work and advocacy and organizing around reproductive justice. So they're great. And if you want to donate, my heart would be very happy, but no pressure.
Amazing.
You want to get the book? That would make my heart very happy too. So
Yeah, I dropped both those links into the chat. I'm going to leave it open for just a minute for folks to leave some love, leave some more comments. I see some folks dropping some praise for you, Megan, as rightfully so. And also just, if you like what you heard tonight, if you like this book, you'll probably like the many others that we have over at gameoverbooks.com. You can follow us on all social media at Game Over Books. We're on Patreon. We do a lot of cool content, so please check us out. We also have other great books that are about spirituality, like Grown from Claudia Wilson. So we do publish lots of different authors and lots of different folks. So go check us out. Other than that, thank you so much again for coming, for listening to poems, for talking with us, for engaging in conversation. I hope that you are having a good, yes, Ginger, I'm doing the outro. This is my dog. She's over here giving commentary. So I hope you're treating yourself well and with patience and grace during all of this time, all of this chaos and whirlwind that we are going through. Whatever you're doing tonight, just have joy as much as you can. And with that, good night, everyone. Be well, be safe, with love. And this was recorded, so we will be putting this up online and on YouTube soon, so be on the lookout for that. But again, thank you all so much, and have a great night.
thank you for coming, friends. Hi, Heather. Thank you, Heather, thank you for reading.
Of course. Thank you for reading.